Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
Everybody has to sort of make that decision on how they're going to place values in this hierarchy. And I think that's really what makes ethics so difficult. Ethics is not so difficult to come up with values that we all agree about: preservation of life, human dignity, etc. Those are all values that we can all agree on. What is difficult is to place the hierarchy, which precedes which, when they're in conflict. Wartime is very different than peacetime, and it's a category mistake to try to apply the ethics of one to the other.
My name is Pablo Ruz Salmones, and I will be your podcast host. Today's episode is from an event in September 2023. In this episode, Mois Navon, founder of Mobileye, will talk to us about AI and autonomous weapons, the ethics of war and peace, and whether the same ethical principles apply in each scenario. Listen now to our conversation. Mois Navon is one of the founding engineers of Mobileye, where he designed the IQ family of SoC system on a chip, the chip powering the autonomous vehicle revolution. He is the author of numerous hardware patents in the field of image processing and computing hardware. Prior to Mobileye, Mois worked for notable companies such as IBM and NASA's JPL, as well as a number of Israeli startups. Mois is also an ordained rabbi who has published numerous articles on Jewish law and lore, as well as lecturing extensively on Jewish topics, and earned the title Rabbi of Mobileye. Mois is currently pursuing his PhD at the Department of Jewish Philosophy at Bar Ilan University, where his thesis seeks to apply Jewish philosophy to address the ethical questions arising in the field of artificial intelligence. His lectures and writings can be found on different places around the internet. One of your most recent publications, precisely on autonomous weapon systems, distinguishes because this is a question that many people ask, irrespective of which country they're in, and obviously it has to do with the history of that country as well, like whether there's been recent wars, or whether it's normally a peaceful country, or whether it's a very violent country, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But you distinguish in that paper between two kinds of ethics: wartime ethics and peacetime ethics as well. So there are two different things. I don't know if you can tell us a bit more about this distinction that you make and why that distinction is important. I mean, if we're going to talk about weapons, it's important to distinguish between peace and war. So why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, okay, very good. First of all, I'd like to comment on the fact that, you discussed the context of the country. Are we at war or not at war? Obviously, everybody knows that Israel is pretty much at war. I mean, officially, there are several states that are openly declared war against Israel, and we're constantly defending ourselves. Nevertheless, these ethical ideas that I'm bringing predate the state of Israel and really go back to, I've been analyzing the biblical text. I mean, one of the difficulties, and Michael Walzer pointed it out, that Judaism has with its approach to war is that we haven't been at war for 2,000 years. He says that from the time of Bar Kokhba, which was a revolt against the Romans 2,000 years ago, approximately, till Ben Gurion, there was no war ethics in Judaism. I mean, everything was quite theoretical. But nevertheless, there are ideas that are being developed through ethical texts, meaning the Bible and the Talmud, and they bring us idea of the dichotomy between peacetime ethics and wartime ethics. And why that's important, and I think it's a game changer in the way we look at autonomous weapons, is because a lot of the philosophers which I quote in that paper don't make that dichotomy and end up applying the kinds of relationships that we expect in peacetime to wartime. And then that really bogs us down trying to do things which are not really contextual, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, Mois. That makes perfect sense.
So there are a lot of issues with autonomous weapons. I mean, there's the technical issues. Can it do what it's supposed to do? Will it make mistakes? There's a philosopher by the name of Purvis who talks about three types of mistakes. Empirical mistakes, where you basically didn't understand what was the thing that you're trying to do. Was it object that you detected a rifle in someone's hand, or was it an umbrella? So that's an empirical mistake. There are practical mistakes, which you tried to shoot the guy with the rifle, but you ended up shooting the guy next to him. And then finally, there are moral mistakes. And so all the philosophers discuss all of those ideas, but at the end of the day, those are sort of engineering questions. How good does this system have to be before we deploy it? What kinds of mistakes, what kinds of bugs? All of those, I think, are engineering questions. They're not so much philosophical questions. And the ultimate philosophical question, which I address in my paper, is that they're arguing that even if we get all the bugs out, and even if the system is perfect and it knows exactly rifles from umbrellas and it has a perfect aim, etc., it's still unethical, they say, to deploy these because of primarily human dignity, that it's undignified to be killed by a machine. And so that's where I deploy this idea of battlefield ethics versus peacetime ethics, is that there's battlefield dignity and peacetime dignity, and they shouldn't be confused.
So you have all these questions and when to apply this wartime ethics and peacetime ethics, depending precisely on that context. And you also mentioned right now the word dignity, which I also believe it's crucial to understanding your point of view on all this. So why don't you tell us a bit about what you mean by dignity in peacetime and dignity in wartime? Because indeed, according to your paper, they mean two different things.
Peacetime dignity is the way we all expect to interact with each other. It's sort of the paradigm that Martin Buber put forth of I and thou. We should all be interacting with people as a thou and not as an it, or in Kantian terms as a subject and not as an object. Whether it's the checker at the market, where you say hello, how are you, thank you, please, etc., to more in-depth interactions. All of our interactions with human beings should be I and thou. That is really the basis of human dignity in peacetime. We could pin it to the idea in Leviticus 19 that says, "Ve'afta l'recha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself. And there's other ways that we could define peacetime human dignity. None of that applies to the battlefield. And that's what, and as I quote in my paper, Thomas Nagel and Robert Sparrow and Peter Asara, who all expect us in some kind of mode to apply that kind of human dignity. Obviously, they don't expect us to say, hello, how are you? Oh, you're the enemy that wants to kill me. But nevertheless, they do want us to apply some kind of I, thou, some kind of relating to the enemy as a subject and not as an object. And what I'm arguing, based on Jewish thought, not about that kind of I, thou with the enemy. It's about trying to defend your country. And that's where the dignity comes in. The dignity is in fighting courageously for your country. And so that's really where I make this distinction. There's numerous biblical verses which support the idea. There's one in the book of Deuteronomy that talks about when you go out to war against your enemies and you see horses and tanks or whatever it is, right? It says there, when you go out to war against your enemies, and the biblical commentator Rashi explains that that the word on your enemies means you must see them as your enemy. And so then the super commentator on Rashi says, why is he bringing this comment at all? Where did he come up with this idea that you should look at them as an enemy? So he says the word enemy in the verse is superfluous. When you go out to war, who goes out to war against their friends? Obviously, you're going out to war against your enemy. So the word is in the Bible to tell you something extra. When you go out to war against your enemies, meaning you must look at them like enemies. Again, it's this idea that wartime is very different than peacetime. And it's a category mistake to try to apply the ethics of one to the other. So that sort of answers your question about human dignity and about this dichotomy. You also brought up this issue of what is war, and there's the war on drugs, for example. And so that gets us into some very blurry contexts, because you're 100% right that so far the war that I'm talking about are wars between nations and not internal wars. So we apply the term war loosely. I'm not really sure how far I can take this dichotomy into the everyday police world. I actually wrote a kind of an addendum to this article, which is applying autonomous weapons for policing. And I believe that I can apply and allow for autonomous weapons for policing based on a completely different approach, which doesn't use this dichotomy, but rather says that there's an idea of din rodef. Din rodef is the law of pursuer. The law of the pursuer is very simple. If you, a bystander on the street, see somebody running with a gun, a knife to go kill somebody else, you have the obligation to stop that pursuer. Now, if you can trip him and he falls down and you can tie him up, so that's very good. However, if your only recourse to stop the pursuer is to kill him, so then you can do that. Okay. And so this idea of the law of the pursuer allows for a lot of activity within the civil realm, basically to preserve life. And so then basically what I'm saying is that now I'm moving away from the whole idea of allowing for autonomous weapons because it's battlefield ethics and those are different. And I'm saying, no, you can even allow for them within policing cases because they are pursuing people who are trying to kill people. So now what happens is, in this case, and the reason I didn't use this line of thought in my article was because it's a bit weaker in the sense that now people can say no, but there is a hierarchy of values and human dignity doesn't override. That's what Thomas Nagel says. He says that you still have an obligation to preserve dignity even when you're going to kill somebody. So Judaism doesn't look at it like that. Judaism there's a hierarchy of values, and preservation of life is above preservation of human dignity of the criminal. Everybody has to sort of like make that decision on how they're going to place values in this hierarchy. And I think that's really what makes ethics so difficult. Ethics is not so difficult to come up with values that we all agree about: preservation of life, human dignity, etc. Those are all values that we can all agree on. What is difficult is to place the hierarchy, which precedes which, when they're in conflict. And so Judaism, again, places preservation of life above human dignity, which today in modern terms is not such a given. Right? The arguments for euthanasia are that human dignity precedes the preservation of life. And it's a difficult question.
Yeah, no, it's very, very difficult. And I mean, you've said so very many interesting things that I want to ask you about all of that you just said. How can this perspective contribute to solving these difficult questions that arise by the development of autonomous weapon systems? I could certainly see throughout your not only just your answer right now, but your thinking in your in the articles and in the other publications that you have. It's certainly there's a lot that your perspective can bring and the Jewish perspective can bring into solving all these problems. So why don't you tell us a bit more about this preservation of life, dignity, and how that can contribute to solving all these different issues we're facing?
Yeah, great. So I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that it's very important that we address, like, I'm bringing Jewish ideas. So Judaism is a religion. It's based on all kinds of things. There's Christianity. They have their background, Buddhism, etc. Why is this relevant to the world? So I think that whenever you're going to bring a perspective from a very specific background, it needs to be universalized. It needs to make sense. It needs to be argued philosophically. So I'm not saying, well, this is what the Bible says, this is the way we read it, and so now everybody should do that. That's not going to fly, right? I could say, okay, the Jews are beholden to this because that's what their belief system and that's their tradition. So I'm not trying to sell Jewish ideas to a non-Jewish audience based on Jewish belief, Ella, but rather I think that I'm trying to bring ethical concepts that can be argued philosophically, meaning logically, and can be accepted for their value. And that's the way I look at also Christian thought and Buddhist thought and or secular thought, right? I mean, we all in these difficult dilemmas are grappling and trying to find some grounding. So I think that Judaism has a lot to offer for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that there's a 3,000-year tradition if you go back to the Bible. There's a 2,000 tradition if you go back to the Talmud. In Judaism, there's an idea called the oral Torah. It's the discussions that continue throughout the generations. And it's really based on the Bible, which says you must go to the judges of your day to solve your problems. Why does it say go to the judges of your day? Because your day is a context. There's an era, and only the people of those times can bring to bear the ethical concepts that have been brought throughout history. And so we believe that these Torah ideas, these Jewish ideas, have been constantly developed. And I would even venture to say that we're the only people on the face of the earth that have a tradition this long that has been lived on a day-to-day basis. That is to say, yes, I'm aware that Buddhist thought has been influencing Buddhist people, and I'm aware that Aristotle has been adopted by Christians and Aquinas and all the way to MacArthur. But the fact of the matter is that these ideas have always been in the purview of the church, of religious people, of the philosophers. Judaism, all these ideas have been developed by people on a day-to-day basis, from the completely mundane, where ethical questions are asked, just how do you tie your shoes, to serious stuff like, when can I disconnect my parent from life support? So all of these questions, there's a huge, huge corpus of literature which embodies these moral ideas as legal precedents, basically, for us to continue to use. And so that's why I think that it's important to access this body of knowledge and to try to argue it not religiously. Again, I do not believe that that's going to be valid, but to argue, to use those ideas philosophically, logically, to help answer the modern questions that artificial intelligence is bringing to bear on all of us in everyday life.
Because we're talking on a case of a nation against a nation, right? But then you have, and I know that could be a deep question in terms of what actually constitutes a nation, because you have many people, many peoples around the world, if you will, and even in some in what you might consider a country, and particularly actually now at the beginning that we were talking a bit about Latin America. That's very, very common in Latin America, because you have some groups before people from Europe came into the American continent, and just history happened. What I'm trying to say is that sometimes it's just not as clear, which I find interesting. And you yourself mentioned that you have kind of like made an addendum to the paper in terms of the law of the pursuer. Sorry. And indeed, there are many, many different things to consider. So in the use of autonomous weapon systems, you've mentioned that you favor their use in battlefield. Why don't you tell us a bit of what those autonomous weapon systems are capable of, or you think will be capable of, and generally speaking, why you think they could be applied using these wartime ethics into the battlefield?
Okay, I mean, today autonomous weapons have the capabilities of all the things that we know that AI has the capabilities of. They can fly drones, they can use GPS, they can locate targets on their own, they can use facial recognition, they can target whatever you want to be targeted. I think that what they have the ability to do is reduce mistakes and reduce fatalities in the field, because you can now use them to be very specific and very accurate. And that goes back again to the question of the empirical failures that could possibly happen and the practical mistakes that could happen. The question really is, how good are they? But if they are as good as they can be, and they're better than people, for sure they're better than people emotionally, right? They're better than people in the sense that they've been given a task and they can go execute the task without all of the baggage that human soldiers bring to the battlefield. So that's why I'm arguing that it's much better to deploy autonomous weapons than not to deploy them. Of course, what would be best is not to have war, right? I end the article by saying that ultimately, if we could have AI not fight our wars, but help us resolve our conflicts, so that would be, like I said in the paper, divine. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. And so what I'm saying is that I think that the technological capabilities of autonomous weapons allow us to do much better whether it's on the battlefield or even with police use. The only reason I'm making a distinction between those two is because we can't apply this distinction or the dichotomy of battlefield ethics versus peacetime ethics when it's a police mission that's being accomplished.
As you're saying, right, this distinction between the battlefield and peacetime, and what you mentioned at the beginning about how dignity is also different in each of these cases. But one thing is how we think of it, and a very different thing is how people feel about it. So if we start using autonomous weapons systems, for example, in the battlefield, let's say, well, people that are going to be there they're still going to be killed, and nations and the people from those nations, even if they're not fighting, they will have a feeling against perhaps these sort of weapons. They might actually feel that their dignity was stripped away, based, perhaps even based on their history or based on their philosophy and based on very many things. That is, we can think of it as that way, but perhaps asking the people that are there at that point in time or the nations involved to at that point realize that, okay, this is a different sort of ethics, and we're not actually losing our dignity. Well, that perhaps will depend on a nation by nation basis, and that might actually affect the way we interact, not just with the overall autonomous weapon systems, but perhaps also with the technology behind it itself, with AI. If we use AWS systems, irrespective of whether using wartime ethics might actually allow us to do so, do you think that will make people relate to these weapons and to the overall AI technology in a different way, even in peacetime, during peace times?
It's a good question. How will people relate to it? I really wrote the article in order to allow governments to feel that it's actually moral to deploy them. Again, because I feel that deploying autonomous weapons will reduce the number of casualties, will reduce the number of conflicts, will reduce the mistakes that are made. And so I think that it's better overall. And then if that's the case, so then people will have a positive perception because the military actions are actually, there's no, let's say, extra collateral damages, and there's no mistakes, and there's more, let's say, pinpointed actions against specific targets that everyone agrees are military, etc. So that's the potential I see. Of course, there's people who argue exactly the opposite. In the invitation that was sent out, there's the propaganda film called Slaughterbots, which paints a dystopian picture, which is exactly opposite of what I'm arguing. Nevertheless, I do believe that the technology will make wars cleaner and more efficient, and in the sense of doing what they need to do without making as big a mess as wars do with people. I mean, it's important to emphasize that I'm not arguing for war, or that I think war is good, or that there is a good war. Obviously, as a religious person, I believe in the prophecy of Isaiah, that nation will not lift up sword against nation, and that's really what we should be striving for.
No, that's great. And overall, I guess like the question that's beyond this, we're now focusing on the battlefield. All this progress in AI and technology, but particularly in AI. How does the relationship between humans and AI looks like? How do you think it will look like? And perhaps even deeper, how do you think the relationship between humans and humans will change because of the current rise of AI?
Interesting. Okay, so I mean, I think that question sort of shifts away from the particular application of autonomous weapons, and it's just in AI in general. And that actually happens to be the topic of my thesis, which you mentioned. I'm writing at Bar Ilan. I actually just finished writing it and have turned it in. I'm waiting for the signatures and all the bureaucracy. In any case, the title of my thesis is The Moral Status of AI, in which I seek to discuss how are we supposed to interact with robots, chat GPT, all these kinds of entities, of beings, and how is that going to change us? So really, I think that the issue is like this. We are wired to interact with with these beings, these entities. Like the minute it starts talking to us like ChatGPT, we start getting involved. The minute that you see a robot with eyes that track you and then speak to you or follow you around, you already begin to interact with it like a human being. And so there's a big question about how should we relate to them. I believe that we still need to relate to them as machines, but nevertheless, we need to relate to them with a kind of human quality. That is to say, we need to preserve our own humanity. And so I force myself to say please and thank you to ChatGPT, even though I know it's a machine, but because it interacts with me like a human being, I want to make sure that I say please and thank you to human beings afterwards. And so that's kind of where I'm at. I don't believe that they're humans. I don't believe that we should give them the status of humans. There are many philosophers who do. And on the other hand, I don't believe that they're just machines that you can just give commands to. But the reason is because of our own humanity, not theirs. Then there's the question of those are for the robots of today, but the AI of tomorrow, where there are labs around the world working on conscious robots and conscious AI. So conscious AI, I believe, is a different level. What I'm saying is that there's the approach that I gave you now about saying please and thank you to machines that interact with us like humans. That's the AI of today. But then the AI of tomorrow is that people are working on conscious AI. And conscious AI, to me, is basically a human being that's not a Homo sapien. I mean, if it has subjective experience like us, if it can feel pain and pleasure like us, if it has second-order phenomenal consciousness, it basically has human status. And in my thesis, I argue that we shouldn't be making those things, because that at the end of the day, we're making AI to serve us. And if you make conscious beings to serve you, you just made slaves, which everyone pretty much agrees we shouldn't be doing. But in any case, even if you don't make them as slaves, I argue that it's not a good thing to be making.
That's great, Mois. Thank you. It's been a true honor. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.